Before we begin, tell me in the comments what time is it where you are watching. Is it nighttime? Or maybe early morning? Tonight, we'll step into a quiet, forgotten story. Not one about magic, but about fear. About a world where even a whisper could stir a storm. Let's begin not with flames or shouting, but with silence. Imagine a small village somewhere in Europe, around the year 1450. The sky is gray. The roofs are low and thatched. Smoke rises gently from chimneys, and chickens peck slowly at the mud-covered roads. Everything looks simple, but beneath that quiet, there is fear. This was a time before science, before medicine made sense, before lightning was explained, or crops had reasons for failing. And when people are surrounded by things they don't understand, they start to look for someone to blame. Someone always a little different. Someone who didn't fit. Maybe it was the woman who walked alone, or the old man who talked to birds, or the midwife who had strange herbs hanging in her window. They didn't need to do anything wrong. They just needed to seem strange enough. For someone to whisper, "She's a witch," they might say, and that was enough to begin something that, once started, was very hard to stop. It didn't begin with arrests or trials. It began with a look, with neighbors who stopped waving, with children who ran away instead of greeting. It began with silence growing louder. Most people didn't want to believe such things. But fear spreads faster than truth. And in places where knowledge is scarce, suspicion becomes powerful. So what did a witch hunt actually look like? Not at first like hunting at all. It was slow. It was quiet. And it was built on stories. Someone would say they saw a cat in the night. Someone else said they dreamed of a shadow. And those little things, barely noticed on their own, began to weave a story that pointed to someone. Usually someone poor. Usually someone without protection. Often a woman. And once a few people agreed that something felt wrong, the fear turned into action. The village elders would call a meeting. The priest might speak in careful words. People would nod, look down, shuffle their feet. And then they would knock on a door. That's where it began. No torches, no flames. Just a quiet knock on an old wooden door. And a voice asking someone to come with them, not to be punished, not yet, just to answer some questions. And that's how a witch hunt truly began, not with shouting, but with silence, suspicion, and the world suddenly looking at you differently. It usually started with a whisper, not a scream, not a grand accusation shouted through the streets. Just something simple, one person telling another, "She's strange, don't you think?" And in small villages, where everyone knew each other's names, routines, and secrets, that was often enough. You see, in those times, people lived very close to fear. They feared the wind if it blew too hard. They feared thunder that struck too near. They feared a goat that stopped giving milk, or a child who fell sick in the night. And when people are afraid, they look for someone to blame. Sometimes it was the old woman who lived alone. She might have been kind, or maybe she just kept to herself. Maybe she had a cat. Maybe she sold herbs. Maybe she stared a little too long at someone's baby, and then the baby caught a fever the next day. That's all it took. Whispers turned into worries. Worries turned into stories. One neighbor said she saw her walking in the woods at night. Another said the bread never rose after she touched it. Someone swore they saw her talking to a crow, like it understood her. No one could prove any of it. But no one could disprove it either. And when something went wrong, when the crops failed, or someone's cow died, or a child had nightmares, it was easier to believe that someone caused it on purpose than to accept that life could just be cruel. That's when the whisper became something heavier, a name spoken in the wrong room, a look exchanged at the market, a priest clearing his throat before suggesting that maybe, just maybe, something unnatural was going on. A tea didn't always happen fast, but it didn't stop once it started. People didn't always think they were doing something wrong. In fact, many believed they were protecting their community. They thought they were doing something good, and so one morning, the woman would wake up to find people outside her home. Sometimes with questions, sometimes with ropes. She hadn't done anything different. But the village had changed around her. That's how it began. Not with evidence, not with magic, but with fear and a whisper. It always started small, not with a dramatic accusation, not with torches or shouting crowds, but with something ordinary. A neighbor's chicken stopped laying eggs. A cow refused to give milk. A child fell ill, even though they'd been healthy. The day before, people didn't know why these things happened. They had no doctors to explain infections, no scientists to describe spoiled crops or changing weather. All they had was the silence after something went wrong and the need to make sense of it. And so they looked around. They noticed the woman who lived alone near the edge of the village. She had no husband. She kept to herself. She gathered herbs from the forest, dried them in bundles, and sometimes gave out bitter teas to those who were sick. Some whispered that her cat watched too closely. Others said her eyes were too sharp, that she always knew when something bad was coming. And one day, when someone finally said it, maybe it's her, it was like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. The ripples spread fast. People remembered things that hadn't seemed important before. How she had once mumbled after being shortchanged at the market. How she didn't go to church every week. How lightning had struck her roof 2 summers ago, and suddenly the village had its answer. It wasn't the sickness. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't bad luck. It was her. They didn't need proof. They needed certainty. Someone 2.2. Someone to carry the fear for everyone else. She might have been kind. She might have helped people for years. She might have done nothing wrong at all, but it didn't matter. Someone had to be blamed. And the first one they chose was always the easiest to isolate. The one who didn't speak loudly. The one who didn't have anyone to defend her. They brought her before the village elders. She didn't understand why. She cried, not because she was guilty, but because no one was listening. The questions came like rain, fast, sharp, without pause. Do you talk to spirits? Have you ever cursed anyone? Do you own a black book? Sometimes the women tried to explain. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. But either way, the ending was usually the same. If she confessed, they said she was guilty. If she denied it, they said she was hiding the truth. It was a trap. And the silence that followed her name became louder than anything she could say. The first accused was rarely the last. Because once a village tasted the feeling of explanation, even a false one, it was hard to stop. So others followed. But the first was the spark, the beginning of the fire, and all because something ordinary went wrong, and the world was too afraid to sit with not knowing. It wasn't a grand courtroom. Most of the places where accused witches were tried weren't large, stone-covered halls with pillars and echoes. They were often simple rooms, quiet, wood-paneled, with windows too small to let in much light. This wasn't a place of justice in the way we think of today. It was a place where suspicion wore robes, where fear sat in a chair and held a quill when a woman or sometimes a man was brought into the trial room. It was rarely the beginning of the process. More often, it was the middle. Whispers had already been exchanged. Neighbors had already spoken. The judge had likely already made a quiet decision, Even before anyone was asked a question, there were no lawyers in most of these places. The accused often stood alone. Sometimes they were asked to confess. Not with force, not yet, but with words like, "Do you deny what everyone already knows?" Or, "Do you understand what will happen if you do not speak?" In that room, silence wasn't neutral. It was dangerous, and truth didn't matter as much as agreement. If you agreed, things might be quicker. If you resisted, things might stretch on. The judge would read a list of accusations. Sometimes they were small: a spoiled batch of milk, a sick child, a cow that refused to give milk. Sometimes they were strange: a dream someone had, a feeling in their bones, a cat that looked at someone the wrong way. Testimonies could come from anyone: a child, a neighbor, even someone who didn't like you and saw an opportunity to be believed. They would ask if the accused had a mark, a mole, a scar, a freckle that looked unusual. They would examine the skin, not for injury, but for mystery. If something couldn't be explained, it was made into evidence, and always people were watching. Even if they weren't in the room, they waited outside, not because they were cruel, but because they were curious. Because this was how fear became community. Some trial rooms had Bibles. Some didn't. Some held crosses. Others held small books full of names and accusations in careful handwriting. And behind every word, behind every sigh, was one question: is she really a witch? No one asked if she was scared. No one asked if she was hungry. No one asked if she had a family waiting at home. This wasn't a room for her. It was a room for a decision. A quiet decision, written down and signed, like it was just another line on another page in a long list of other names. Some were let go. Some were sent away. Some were sentenced, not because they were proven guilty, but because someone needed them to be. And when they left the trial room, the air outside always felt different, colder, lighter, or maybe it was just the wind, because justice back then wasn't about what was true. It was about what people were ready to believe. It always began quietly, long before anyone knocked on a door or rang a bell, long before the crowd whispered in the fields or the name was written down. People already knew, not facts, but feelings. A tension in the village, a restlessness in the wind. Something was coming when the witchfinder arrived. It was not with thunder, no loud army, no grand horses, just a man on a worn road, sometimes alone, sometimes with an assistant or two. He came by foot or cart, tired from travel, holding scrolls and tools wrapped in cloth. His clothes were not fine. His eyes were not angry. Often, he looked like any other traveler. Quiet, focused, watchful. People gathered at the edge of the village, not to greet him warmly, but because they were curious. Some watched from windows, others from behind fences. They had heard stories of what he did, of what he could find. They whispered to one another, wondering if he would stop there or pass by. But when he stopped, everything changed. The witchfinder was not there to accuse. That's not how it started. He asked questions, calm, polite, even soft ones. He spoke to the mayor, the pastor, the elders. He asked about unusual behavior, about illnesses with no explanation, about livestock that had died suddenly, bread that wouldn't rise, storms that came too soon. He listened to the answers with quiet interest, and then he asked another question. Has anyone stood out lately? That was the moment people started looking sideways, not with cruelty, not with certainty, but with doubt. The old woman who lived near the woods and spoke to birds. The girl who always wandered near the river alone. The man who never came to Sunday prayer, but always seemed to know things early. The witch finder took notes. Simple notes. Not judgments, just observations. But it was enough. Soon, he asked to speak to them. One by one. No jail. No guards. Just a conversation. And yet, people watched those conversations with breath held tight. Some villagers began to avoid those who had been questioned. Some offered quiet support. Others locked their doors. All the while, the witch finder remained calm. He did not accuse. He asked. He listened. He wrote. He examined hands for marks. Checked for signs, moles, scars, birthmarks. He asked about dreams, about strange smells, about bad luck, and the people caught between fear and belief. Wanted answers. They wanted the strange things in their lives to make sense, and the witch finder offered that sense. He gave shape to uncertainty. Whether he believed what he was doing, no one really knew. Maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe he was simply doing what he was paid to do. But once he was there, it was like the air itself changed. Like everyone became aware of what they said, how they moved, who they stood next to, because once the witch finder arrived, no one wanted to be the next name on his list. Let's pause here, because by now, the person accused of being a witch has been taken, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. The village has done its whispering. The officials have arrived. And now we reach the part that history often wraps in. Drama and noise, the trial, but it wasn't really a trial in the way we think of today. There was no proper defense, no fair hearing, no one waiting patiently to hear both sides. Once someone was called a witch, the question wasn't, is she guilty? It was, how do we prove it? In some places, the accused stood before a small group of men, clergy, magistrates, town elders. They sat behind tables, often in rooms that smelled of smoke and old parchment. And the accused would stand often alone, facing questions that were more like traps than paths to the truth. Do you speak to spirits? Have you ever cursed a neighbor? Can you say the Lord's Prayer without stumbling? Some of the questions seemed simple, but in those times, fear twisted the meaning of everything. If your voice trembled, they said it was guilt. If you looked too calm, they said you were possessed. And then came the stories. Villagers might come forward, not always out of cruelty, sometimes out of fear or confusion or pressure. They would say things like, "She walked past my field, and the cow died. I dreamt of her face the night the storm came." Or even, "She has a mark on her arm I've never seen before." These were not facts. They were feelings. But feelings back then were treated like evidence, and if someone tried to defend the accused, they risked being accused themselves. So most stayed quiet. Sometimes strange tests were used, touching bread and cheese, tying the accused's hands and feet, and watching what happened in water, or looking for so-called witch marks, moles, scars, anything a body might naturally have, and if nothing was found, that was suspicious too. There was no winning. The trial was not built to find the truth. It was built to confirm a fear, to protect the village, not the individual. And so, many trials ended the same way, with a sentence already half written, with heads turned away, with people telling themselves, "We had to be sure." And then the next day came, and the wind kept blowing, and the village moved on. When the whisper of suspicion grew loud enough, the trial followed. It didn't happen right away, and it didn't always follow the laws as we understand them today. But in many towns during the height of the witch hunts, A formal accusation meant a woman or sometimes a man would be called before a room of quiet faces and told to defend herself against something no one could quite define. There was no need for proof. Only fear. In most places, the trial took place in a town hall or a church, sometimes just in a barn. It depended on what was available. The judge was often a local official, someone with influence, but not always with wisdom. He might have believed he was doing the right thing. He might have just been scared too. The accused would be brought in quietly. She might be older. She might be someone who lived alone. Someone with no family to speak on her behalf. Someone who had always been a little different. Maybe she gathered herbs, or sang to herself, or simply walked too often at night. People would gather to listen. Some were curious. Some came out of duty. Others came because they were afraid of not showing up. There was no jury in the modern sense. Just voices. Eyes. A silence that often weighed more than words. The accusations were read out loud. Sometimes it was something simple, that the cow of a neighbor had stopped giving milk, that a baby had fallen ill, that the weather turned suddenly after a disagreement. The accusations sounded small, but they didn't feel small, and in a room full of frightened people, small things became heavy things. The accused would be asked questions, not easy ones, and not always answerable. Have you ever spoken to a dark spirit? Why were you seen near the woods after sundown? Do you deny that your eyes caused someone pain? Sometimes, if she denied the charges, they said the devil was helping her lie. If she stayed quiet, they said it was proof she was hiding something. There was no right way to respond, and no clear path to freedom, and so she stood there, often alone, often trembling, while others debated the shape of her soul. Some broke down. Some remained silent. Some looked the judge in the eye and asked to be treated with dignity. A tea didn't always help. There were no defense lawyers, no records kept with care, no fairness in how long someone could be held or how many questions they had to answer. But what was always present was the fear, not just hers, but the town's. They were afraid of sickness, of storms, of the unknown. And they needed a name to give their fear. So they gave it hers. And that often was how the trial began, not with fire or shouting, but with quiet, with folded hands, with neighbors who could not explain what was happening around them, and so chose to blame the one person who never quite fit in, and in that stillness, a judgment would be formed, sometimes spoken, sometimes written, but always deeply human, and in its quietest form terrifying. The trials were quiet at first. There was no shouting, no chaos, no sweeping drama like in the stories people tell today. Most of the time, it began with a room, a table, a few men in long robes or rough coats, a record keeper with a quill, a woman accused, tired, often confused, standing before them. She might be someone from the village, someone the baker knew, someone who helped deliver a neighbor's baby, someone who once sang to children or tended to animals behind her cottage. Now, she stood in front of people who asked her very serious questions, using very serious words. Have you consorted with spirits? Do you renounce the devil? Did you speak charms into the air on a moonless night? And it wasn't always about proof. Not the kind of proof you might think. There were no photographs, no recordings, no evidence that could be weighed on a scale. There were only stories. And fear. Sometimes one person's story was enough. I saw her walking alone after dark. I heard her muttering. My cow died after she looked at it. These were the pieces they used to build a case. Some trials took place in wooden rooms where people whispered outside the windows. Others happened in larger halls, where the villagers came and sat and stared. In some regions, the trial was not in a court, but in the church itself. A place meant for peace became a place for judgment. If the woman said nothing, they called it guilt. If she defended herself, they said the devil was helping her lie. If she cried, they said witches weep. Easily when caught. If she didn't, they said she had no remorse. It was a trap made of words, and some of those words were so old, no one really knew what they meant anymore. But they sounded important. They sounded like truth. And so people listened. There were questions about herbs, about dreams, about the way she looked at someone, or didn't. Sometimes they looked for marks on her skin, little blemishes or birthmarks. They believed these were signs, places where the devil had touched her. They examined her body, not to understand, but to accuse. And through all of it, the woman stood, maybe trembling, maybe praying, maybe just trying to stay still because any movement might be misunderstood. Sometimes she had a child with her. Sometimes she was very old. And sometimes she didn't speak the same language as the people asking the questions. Still, the trial would go on. There were no lawyers in the way we know them today. No protections. No defense that truly worked. The people in charge believed they were doing something righteous, that they were keeping the village safe, that they were saving souls, and in that belief, they listened only for what they wanted to hear. When the trial ended, it didn't always mean punishment right away. Sometimes they waited. Sometimes they asked for more testimony. Sometimes they called for the woman to be locked away until she confessed. But in many cases, the outcome had already been decided. Not by evidence, not by reason, by fear. And in the silence of the courtroom, while the ink dried on the paper, another name was added to the list. Let's take a moment to think about what it meant to be accused of witchcraft, not in a dramatic way, not with torches and crowds shouting, but in a much quieter, more confusing sense. A neighbor said something. A child pointed. Someone whispered that you gave them a strange look, and the next day, their cow stopped giving milk. It didn't have to be more than that. You might be brought into a room. It was usually cold, often bare, a few wooden chairs, maybe a heavy table. Someone would sit across from you and ask you simple questions. Your name, where you lived, if you had spoken to anyone strange lately, and then the questions would change. Have you spoken with spirits? Do you talk to animals at night? Why were you near the river after dark? The person asking wouldn't be angry. Not yet. They might even sound gentle. But their eyes, they were searching, looking not just at what you said, but how you said it, how quickly, whether you hesitated, and every word mattered, because for many people, the only way to stay safe was to say the right thing or to say nothing at all. Some people denied everything. They looked the judges in the eye and said, "No, I am not a witch." They said it once, twice, 10 times. And sometimes it worked, but sometimes the more you denied it, the more suspicious you looked. Other people tried something else. They told stories about bad dreams, about strange animals that came to them in the night, not because they believed it, but because they thought the judges wanted to hear it. And strangely, that worked too. Sometimes there was no clear rule. Saying too much could get you into trouble. Saying too little could do the same. Silence was power, but silence was also dangerous. Some people tried to explain away their behavior. I was just walking home, they said. I didn't know the well was poisoned. I didn't see that star in the sky. I don't even know what it means. But once suspicion had landed on you, even the most ordinary details could feel strange. I saw her washing herbs. I heard her muttering, "She walks in the woods." Alone, it didn't take much, and so people chose their words very carefully. Some begged, some wept. Others sat still and refused to speak. Every answer was a gamble. Some judges looked for remorse. Some looked for guilt. Some just looked tired, hoping for the session to end, and if someone offered a confession, even a small one, they were sometimes offered mercy. Not always. But sometimes .it was a strange logic. Admit you were a witch, and you might survive. Deny it completely, and you might not. Some said what they had to say just to protect their families. I did it, they whispered, not because they believed it, but because they thought those words might be the ones that saved them. And the saddest part, sometimes they were, and sometimes they reread single quotes t.so in those quiet rooms with cold wooden walls and long shadows. Words became everything. Words could free you. Words could bury you. And for those accused who didn't understand the rules, who couldn't guess what the questioner truly wanted, every breath, every pause, every simple sentence felt like walking on ice. And in the end, even silence was a sentence. Not everyone accused of witchcraft spoke. Some didn't have the words. Some were too frightened. And some, deep down, believed that silence was the only power left to them. In towns across Europe, small and cold, a woman might be pulled from her home and brought before a gathering of men. A table, a chair, a few candles flickering, and many eyes watching. She would be asked questions quickly, often unfairly. Who taught you the spell? Why did the milk sour? Why did the baby fall ill after you passed the door? Some answered with trembling lips. Others wept. But a few said nothing. They stood or sat, sometimes for hours, looking down or straight ahead. Their silence wasn't defiance exactly. It was something quieter, a kind of surrender, a choice to not give the accuser what they wanted, even if the price was high. The records from those trials sometimes say very little. She would not speak. She refused to confess, or simply, no words. But in that absence, something powerful still lingers. Not everyone can be broken with questions. Not everyone will trade peace for freedom. And not every silence means guilt. Of course, the courts didn't see it that way. To remain silent was, to many, an admission. Because why wouldn't you speak? Unless you had something to hide? But that question ignores the fear. It ignores the weight of centuries. It ignores the knowledge that sometimes, the more you say, the worse it gets. So some women and men, too, said nothing. They didn't cry out. They didn't plead. They sat in the stillness, even when the room grew colder and that quiet. Unsettled people, it's easier to condemn someone who shouts. Harder somehow, when they sit without protest. Over time, their names faded from the records. Many of them were forgotten. But their silence remains. It echoes in the spaces where words used to be, in pages left nearly blank, and testimony that begins and then stops, and perhaps that silence says more than any confession ever could. Let's talk about something that makes this part of history even more difficult to understand and quietly sad. There were times when the people making the accusations were children. In small villages, stories spread easily. People talked. Whispers filled the air like smoke in winter. Everyone heard something, even if no one was sure what was true. And children, curious, imaginative, and sometimes afraid, heard it all. They heard the grown-ups speak in worried tones. They heard about witches living among them. They listened to stories about dark magic and hidden curses. Sometimes they were even told to watch out for odd behavior, even in their own neighbors, and slowly, the fear that lived in adults began to settle into the minds of the young. Some children truly believed what they said. They weren't lying not on purpose. They were just repeating what they had heard, or what they thought they saw. A neighbor walking at night, a woman muttering to herself, a cat that looked too clever. All of it could feel like proof when your world was full of warnings. And some children, well, they may have felt pressure. Maybe from parents. Maybe from the church. Maybe they wanted to be believed. Maybe they liked being listened to. For once, in a world where children were rarely taken seriously, suddenly, their words mattered, and that kind of power, even if quiet, could be heavy in the hands of someone so young. One child's words could start a trial. One sentence whispered in the wrong ear could lead to someone being questioned or worse. In places like Salem and across parts of Europe, there are records, real ones, of children pointing fingers, describing dreams, saying they had seen witches fly or transform, or whisper spells into the wind. The adults, already afraid, listened carefully, sometimes too carefully, and the children sometimes changed their minds. But by then, it was too late. The stories had already grown. The fear had already settled in. There's no way to know exactly what those children felt. Some may have been scared. Some may have been proud. Some may have told themselves they were doing the right thing. But when we look back now, it's clear that even the smallest voice, in the wrong moment, could become part of something much bigger, something that couldn't be taken back. In the end, it's not a chapter filled with shouting or noise. It's a quiet kind of sadness. The kind that makes you wonder how fear moves not just through cities or courts, but through families, through whispers, through stories told at night, because sometimes, in the middle of all the grown-up panic, the ones who shape the future of someone's life were just children, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make much sense at all. By the time the 18th century arrived in many parts of Europe, the fires had started to burn lower. Not the literal ones, though those, too, began to go out, but the metaphorical ones. The fear, the panic, the deep suspicion that had settled into everyday life like a layer of soot. Slowly, the world began to shift. And so did the way people thought about witches. There wasn't one moment when it stopped. No loud declaration. No sudden change. It was slower than that. Softer. Like morning fog lifting from fields over time. You might not notice when it starts. But one day, you look up and realize the air is clearer. In towns that once held public trials and whispered accusations in church pews, there was quiet. People still talked about witches, yes. But now it was different. It was more like a memory. A story told by older relatives at the edge of a fire. Not something to be feared. In the daylight, what changed? Well, part of it was books. New ideas. People had started to question things. Not just witches, but the reasons they were blamed in the first place. Philosophers wrote long essays. Doctors began to offer explanations for things once called curses. Mental illness, they suggested. Natural disease. Weather patterns. Human behavior. Things that had once been labeled unnatural were slowly understood as part of life. In courtrooms, judges grew skeptical. Juries hesitated. More and more, trials ended not in punishment, but in dismissal. The burden of proof had shifted, and belief, so long rooted in fear, began to weaken. The last known execution for witchcraft in Europe happened in the 1700s. That's not so long ago, really. But it was also a world away. Even after that, accusations didn't disappear completely. In some isolated places, the fear lingered. but they no longer defined a generation, no longer shaped entire towns. They were remnants, echoes of something. The world had mostly let go, and with that release came a strange kind of silence. Some people missed the certainty, the belief that every misfortune had a cause, that every shadow could be explained by a curse or a spell, but most people just exhaled. Life moved forward. Children were born. Markets grew. Books replaced trials. Curiosity replaced fear, and the world, at least for a while, got a little quieter. Today, when we hear about witch hunts, we think of history, something far away. We imagine pointed hats and bubbling pots and thunder in the background, but the truth was never that dramatic. It was ordinary. It was cold mornings, whispered suspicions, misunderstandings dressed as evidence, and the long, slow journey toward letting go of fear. That's the part most people forget, that history doesn't always end in a bang. Sometimes it ends in silence. A silence that says, we've learned. We'll do better. Let's move on. And in that quiet, the last fire finally dies out. For a long time, the world believed it was doing the right thing, that rooting out witches was a kind of protection for the town, for the children, for the crops, for the church. But over time, something started to shift, not quickly, not loudly, just gradually. Like a season turning, the first change didn't come from kings or popes. It came from smaller things. A neighbor starting to doubt a story. A juror pausing longer before a verdict. A priest who chose silence instead of certainty. And slowly, the wind began to move differently. Some people started asking quiet questions. What if she didn't do it? What if the milk spoiled because it was too warm? What if that strange mark wasn't the devil's, just a birthmark? They didn't shout these thoughts. They just let them sit there like stones in their pockets. Heavy, uncomfortable. But real philosophers began to write, not in fear, but in reason. Doctors stepped forward saying, this isn't possession, it's illness. And slowly, science began to take root where superstition once stood. Of course, there was resistance. Some places held on tightly to the old ways. There were still whispers in alleyways, still women who walked too quietly and were looked at too long. Still fear, because fear is patient, but the trials became less frequent. The punishments less harsh. The crowds less eager. Books were written that questioned everything. Letters were sent between cities. And even some of the judges who once handed down the harshest sentences began to wonder if they had been wrong. You couldn't undo what had been done, but you could stop doing it again. That was the beginning. And so the wind changed, not all at once, but slowly, softly, town by town, law by law. One day, a woman was accused, and no one came to her door. Another day, a trial was planned, and no one showed up. Another, someone said, she's not a witch. She's just different. And this time, the crowd nodded, just a little, just enough. Time has a way of sweeping away what fear leaves behind, not to forget it, but to clear space for something quieter, something closer to truth. And in those slow winds of change, the world took its first breath of relief, not because everything was better, but because it had finally begun to stop hurting itself in the name of safety. That's how all great changes start, not with thunder, but with a pause, and then a whisper, and then a step away from the fire. By the time the world began to question the hunts, many years had passed. Generations had come and gone. The old forests had changed, and the towns had grown. But somewhere in the background, that long, quiet fear, the fear of witches, had started to lose its grip. It didn't happen in one moment. There was no single day when everyone agreed to stop. No great announcement. No torch laid down in the town square. It happened slowly, like a mist lifting from a quiet field. First came the thinkers, philosophers, doctors, scholars, people who had spent time reading, wondering, asking. They didn't shout. They wrote letters, published small books, had conversations in dusty rooms with candles flickering in the corners. They asked questions like, could this really be magic? Could illness be caused by something we don't yet understand? Could fear be louder than truth? Then came the judges. Some of them were tired. Tired of the same stories, the same accusations, the same frightened neighbors pointing fingers. A few of them started saying, no, there's not enough proof, and that small word, no, began to echo. People still whispered. But the whispers began to sound weaker. They didn't carry the same weight. In one village, a girl was accused of witchcraft after a storm ruined the crops. But the local priest stepped forward and said, storms come and go. She did not call the wind, and that was that. In another town, someone tried to revive the old customs, holding up a spoon to look for reflections, measuring birthmarks, watching the fires flicker, but no one showed up to watch. Not because they weren't curious, but because they were tired of the fear, tired of the guessing, tired of pretending they understood something they didn't. And so slowly, quietly, the world began to turn its attention elsewhere. To roads, to science, to medicine, to trade, to clocks and calendars and new kinds of farming. The fear didn't disappear completely. It lingered in corners. It lived in old books and stories told at bedtime, but it stopped deciding people's fate. The last witch trial in Europe happened much later than most people think. Some say it was in the 1700s. Others argue about dates. But by then, the world had changed so much that the trial felt out of place, like opening a door to a room no one had entered in decades. Dust in the air. No one quite sure why they were there. The idea of the witch became more legend than law. Something drawn in. Stories, not courtrooms. Something feared only in tales, not testimony. And that was how it ended, not with a bang, not with a decision, but with silence, with forgetting, with people choosing to believe in something else. And when the silence finally settled, the forests stood still. The wind moved through the trees without being questioned, and the night long feared simply became dark again. Nothing more, nothing magical, just quiet. Let's take a breath together. We've come a long way through shadows and whispers, through cold stone walls and dim candlelight. And now we've reached the end, not with answers, but with silence, because when the last witch trial ended, when the last name was cleared, and the final accusations faded into history books, the silence remained. And in that silence, something stayed behind. Not curses, not spells, but memory. Whole villages returned to their rhythm. The markets opened. Children played in the fields again. The church bells rang. But the places that had once echoed with fear, they didn't forget. Not really. There were empty chairs in some homes. Names that no one spoke anymore. Wells that people avoided. Trees no one sat under, and people didn't always talk about what had happened. But they remembered it, because that's the strange thing about stories like these. They don't disappear. They settle. They wait. They whisper in quiet corners, and appear in old letters tucked inside drawers. They become warnings. They become lessons. They become the parts of history we carry, even when we're not sure how the witch trials ended, but the fear that started them never quite left. It just changed shape, and over time, people began to see it for what it was: fear of what we don't understand, fear of those who are different, fear of power in the hands of someone unexpected. But we learned something too. We learned that justice should not be driven by whispers, that truth does not come from fear, that silence, when forced, is not. Peace, and maybe that's what makes the story worth telling now, quietly, softly, when the world is still, because it reminds us to be gentler with what we do not understand. To ask questions kindly. To listen longer. And above all, to never forget what happens when voices are silenced by those too eager to point, and too afraid to think. So tonight, as we let this story rest, we remember not just the fear, but also the healing that followed, the slow rebuilding of trust, the first time someone dared to say she was only different, not dangerous. The first time someone listened instead of judged. The first time a village let a woman speak, and no one called her a witch. That's what the silence left behind. Not darkness, but the space for light to return. And now, that light is yours too. Carry forward. Thank you for walking quietly through this story. Good night.